Hello, welcome to everyone that's tuning in to this presentation today. I wanted to thank you all for attending and also thank PIBC and the conference organizers for inviting us to be a part of this conference and to share our work with all of you today. My name is Emily Hansen, and I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague, Christy Tataby. Christy and I are research associates at the Institute for Sustainable Food Systems at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we at the ISFS operate on the unceded traditional lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tawasin, Kikite, Coquitlam, and Coquitlam peoples, and we also have projects in Silk Territory. My colleagues and I at the ISFS are honored to live and work on these lands, and the Institute is committed to supporting Indigenous communities working to realize their food sovereignty goals. So the ISFS is an applied research and extension unit at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, which is located in the lower mainland of BC. And as research associates, Christy and I work on a number of projects related to food system policy and planning. We've partnered with local and provincial governments, health authorities, community organizations, farmers, and other food system stakeholders to understand and advance food policy and planning. So with our presentation today, I'm going to start with a little background addressing the question around why planners should think about food systems and plan for food systems. We'll introduce our food policy and planning research and share findings from a recent survey we conducted of Canadian planners. And finally, we'll talk to a panel of planners from across BC about their experiences engaging in food systems planning work. So first off, why plan for food systems? Why should planners think about and develop strategies to address food systems development? So this is really a question that drives a lot of our work and our research. So you might be familiar with the concept of food systems, but I just wanted to start with a definition. And here we describe food systems as a complex network of resources, people, and activities that are engaged in producing and provisioning food for communities. So this system includes activities such as farming, food processing, distribution, retailing, consumption, and the management of waste. And based on this definition, you can start to understand how we're all involved in the food system in one way or another, and how planning activities intersect with many, if not all, components of the food system. So the quote on this slide is from research conducted over 20 years ago by planning researchers Pathacucci and Kaufman, who identified food systems as a significant blind spot in urban planning and policy agendas and within the planning profession more broadly. So they said that the relegation of food issues to the lower end of the urban agenda means that the varied and complex ways that food issues are embedded in our lives are not well understood by city residents. The same holds true for most urban policy officials who fail to comprehend the importance of the urban food system for the quality of urban life. So in their research, Pathacucci and Kaufman really highlighted what they referred to as the puzzling emission of food systems from contemporary planning agendas. And since then, it's been argued that by failing to address food systems, particularly through local level planning and policy initiatives, we can really exacerbate food systems issues and inequities, and also fail to capitalize on the benefits of building stronger local food systems. So at the local level, the emission of food systems from the planning agenda can contribute to higher rates of diet-related disease and food insecurity. It can also limit healthy food access and the viability of new food businesses and infrastructure. And it can also lead to the loss of farmland and encourage speculative ownership of farmland, which can really drive up the prices and make good quality farmland inaccessible to farmers. At the national level, policy approaches that focus primarily on agriculture and trade have really limited the development of regional food supply chains, created challenges for small-scale food processing, and limited opportunities to increase local food procurement in public sectors. So since the limited attention paid to food systems was highlighted 2 decades ago and really brought to the attention of the professional planning community, interest in addressing food issues through policy and planning has really increased. We can sort of think of this period as a new era of food planning, where planners and communities have looked to food systems planning as a way to mitigate a broad range of societal challenges and also to capitalize on some of the benefits of local food system development. So for example, during this time, we've seen cities develop new urban food policies to address issues related to waste, food access, and health. Communities have also addressed food systems in comprehensive planning activities, including consideration of local food system development in their OCPs. Food policy councils have emerged as spaces where food system stakeholders engage in discussion and help to inform local level policy. And there's also been planning action happening at the federal level with the introduction of the new food policy for Canada in 2019. And this policy comes after over a decade of grassroots advocacy for more comprehensive national level food policy that was carried out by community organizations across Canada. Within this national food policy, some of the initial policy directives focus on increasing food security in northern and isolated communities, the development of infrastructure for food processing and waste management, and support of climate change mitigation in agriculture. So while we recognize the emerging nature of the food systems field and a lot of this progress that's been made over the last 2 decades, we also know that food systems planning is not widely practiced in Canadian communities. And there's also limited research and support for advancing this field. So as a research institute, we're increasingly called upon to support efforts to understand and address some of these key food policy questions. And this ongoing work has inspired the development of a 3-year research program to better understand and support the practice of food systems planning in Canada. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time describing sort of an overview of that work. So the research has been divided into 3 phases. The first phase involves a survey of Canadian planners, which I'm going to report on a little bit today. The second phase will involve in-depth case study analysis of food systems planning in Canadian communities. And finally, a third phase will involve working with municipal and regional planning partners in the Okanagan to engage in applied food systems planning at the bioregional level. So this research, these 3 phases of research will take place over 3 years and have been fully funded by the Shirk College and Community Innovation Fund. So the research program was really developed to support the advancement of food systems planning in Canada. And the goals of the research are to conduct novel food systems planning research in Canada, support planners to engage in food systems work, and to raise the profile of food systems within the planning profession. So as mentioned, our first phase of research involved a survey of Canadian planners, which was conducted to better understand their knowledge and preparedness to work in the food systems planning field. So the survey was developed in partnership with the Canadian Institute of Planners, and we collected responses from 35 planners across Canada. The survey was open from October 2020 to January 2021. And we worked with an advisory committee of 15 professional planners and practitioners from across Canada to help us develop the questionnaire. So on this slide, you can just see where we collected responses from. So you can see the majority of responses came from BC and Ontario. And we collected responses from each province and territory with the exception of Nunavut. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the survey findings and focus on key areas of education and training, knowledge and expertise, involvement in food systems planning, some of the barriers to advancing food systems planning within the profession, and finally talk about conclusions and some next steps in the research. So first up is education and training, and we're going to start off talking a little bit about formal education. So overall, 60% of the respondents to our survey indicated that they had a planning degree, 21% were current students enrolled in a planning degree program, and 15% had a post-secondary degree in a non-planning discipline. So in order to understand the opportunities in formal education, we asked respondents if they'd taken courses related to food systems or agriculture as part of their formal education. And the results on this slide are for those who indicated that they either had a planning degree or were currently enrolled in a planning degree program. So as you can see here, 13% indicated that they took a food-related course as part of their planning degree program. 7% took a food-related course outside of their planning degree program, and 3% took courses both inside and outside of their planning degree program. And 74%, so the overwhelming majority of respondents in this category did not take any food-related courses. We also asked the same question to respondents with non-planning degrees. And on this slide, you can see their responses. So 32% of those respondents indicated that they took some kind of food-related course, and 63% did not. So for the respondents who had taken a food-related course, we asked them to describe the content or the theme, and we analyzed those open-ended responses and grouped them by theme category. So the most common course theme was agriculture. These courses address production-related topics such as soil science or animal husbandry. Another common theme of these courses was agricultural or rural planning, and this included a number of respondents who indicated their degree focused on rural planning, and they took a number of courses during their formal education that related to that theme. So for respondents who said that they took courses focused on food systems generally, they often talked about courses that address social, ecological dynamics of food. Some of these respondents mentioned courses that focus specifically on global food systems or addressed food systems in the global south. We also had some respondents who indicated that they took courses relating to food policy and planning specifically. And they mentioned topics such as food governance, food policy development, and mentioned learning about food policy development in different contexts. So some mentioned more global context and some mentioned a more local context. Other food-focused courses address less common themes like food security, urban food systems, and food justice. And food was also addressed as a theme in some courses that were more focused on environmental planning, sustainability, health, or economic development. So when it comes to education and training, we also asked respondents about the kind of professional development opportunities that they'd engaged in related to food. Overall, 61% indicated that they had engaged in some kind of professional development opportunity that addressed food. And we also asked them about the type of professional development opportunity. And from these results, we discovered that respondents relied on professional development opportunities outside of the planning profession, which included conferences or webinars by non-planning organizations. And respondents often mentioned either farming organizations or community-based food security organizations as places they would go to for this kind of professional development learning. And volunteering with food security, food-related organizations was also commonly identified as a professional development opportunity related to food. We also found that respondents did take advantage of some professional development opportunities within the planning profession. So respondents mentioned attending sessions and workshops at planning conferences, and some also took advantage of continuous professional learning opportunities on food-related topics. Now we're going to move on to talking a little bit about knowledge and expertise. So as part of the survey, we asked respondents to rate their level of knowledge about a series of food systems areas. And the results on this slide show the results from that self-assessment. So the green bar indicates the percentage of respondents who assess themselves to have a good or very good level of knowledge in that area. The yellow bar indicates the percentage of respondents who had an adequate level of knowledge, and the purple bar indicates the percentage of respondents who had a poor or a very poor level of knowledge in that area. So overall, urban agriculture and community gardens, health and nutrition, and agriculture were among the highest, the areas with the highest level of knowledge. And Indigenous food sovereignty, food workers and labor, and fisheries and marine food systems were areas where planners had the lowest level of knowledge. So based on this knowledge assessment, we also assessed overall food systems knowledge across all of these areas by applying a numerical score to each response. So in this case, with the index we used, respondents with a higher score had a higher level of knowledge across all these areas. And based on this assessment, we found that 11% of respondents had a high level of knowledge across these areas, 68% had a medium level of knowledge, and 21% had a low level of knowledge across all the food system areas we assessed. So now we're going to move on to talking about involvement in food systems planning. So we asked respondents to indicate if they were involved in food systems planning. Overall, we found that 45% said that they were involved, with 10% indicating that it was a primary focus of their work, and 35% saying that it was a part of their work, but not a primary focus. Oops, let's go back. Okay, so we also assessed involvement in food systems planning based on the sector that planners were working in. And here we're just showing the results for respondents who are working in the local government sectors. This was the largest group of respondents who participated in the survey. So here you can see that of local government respondents, 45% indicated that they were involved in food systems planning, but it was not a primary focus of their work. And just 3% indicated that they were involved in food systems planning as a primary focus of their work. So these results likely reflect the diverse responsibility of local government planners and the relevance of food systems planning to a number of different planning domains at the local level. So now we're going to move on to talk about some of the barriers that were identified. And these are barriers that are limiting participation of planners in food systems planning and advancement of the field more generally. So we asked respondents to choose the top 5 barriers that they perceived in their work. And based on these responses, the most significant barrier identified was a lack of knowledge about food systems amongst planners. Competing goals and priorities, a lack of political support, and limited budgets were also identified as significant barriers. Respondents also identified perceived limited influence over the food system as a barrier to advancing food systems planning. In addition to selecting from this list, we also asked respondents to identify any additional barriers that they identified in their work. One that often came up was a lack of diversity in planning and food systems fields. So food systems impacts are experienced differently by different communities. For example, the highest rates of food insecurity are recorded in Black and Indigenous households. And respondents highlighted that a lack of diversity in planning and decision-making roles could mean that these disproportionate impacts are not well understood or addressed within planning. And respondents also identified little public awareness and interest in food systems and a tension between urban and rural planning domains as additional barriers. So that was sort of a high-level overview of our results, and we're going to continue to write them up and report on the findings from the survey. So those complete findings should be available later on in the summer. But now I'm going to move on just to share a few initial conclusions and talk about some of the next steps to the research. So the survey yielded information about how planners have and have not been prepared to work on food systems issues and where some of the challenges are when we think about advancing the field of food systems planning. So generally, planners have expressed interest in better engaging in food systems planning and have identified this as an important issue to address in their work. And one thing we learned from the survey was that planners have a limited knowledge about food systems and how food issues can be addressed in planning. So some key knowledge gaps were identified in the survey, and these included, first and foremost, an understanding of how planning is connected to food systems. Many respondents recognize the critical linkages between food systems and other areas of planning like climate change, economic development, land use planning, but there seemed to be a limited knowledge around what tools are available and how planning approaches and goals can be aligned across these areas. There was also a lack of knowledge around how to address important issues around Indigenous food sovereignty and food justice and equity. And respondents expressed limited knowledge and understanding of how to advance food planning in urban communities beyond sort of the narrow focus on urban agriculture and community gardening. We also found that planners perceive their level of influence over the food system to be limited or in some cases unclear. This was a common perception, especially for individuals working in local government contexts who communicated that food systems often seem to fall outside of their scope of work. So we found that within local planning agencies, planners communicated that there's no clear home for food systems. And we can often see food issues being addressed from a variety of perspectives, whether it's through sustainability planning, public health work, climate change, land use planning. And this kind of diversity of approaches reflects the sentiment that we heard from planners in our survey, that food systems are connected to many different planning and policy areas, but aren't really effectively captured within any one single domain. And respondents also identified silos within planning agencies as creating challenges to address food planning in a comprehensive way, especially when we see this sort of diversity of approaches and food systems planning being addressed through different lenses, sort of depending on where capacity might be. It was also communicated in the survey that there's a lack of clarity around, particularly when it comes to local governments, around what the responsibilities are when it comes to food systems planning. And this comes from sort of a lack of clear jurisdictional responsibilities. And this was summed up well by one of our survey respondents who said, I honestly never thought about food systems as even a part of the planning realm. I would have assumed that as a federal agriculture jurisdiction. As urban farming becomes more of interest, I think that's when some of these issues might be introduced, but never really thought about it at all. So this kind of demonstrates that sentiment that, especially for planners working at the local level, food systems planning just kind of isn't within their scope of work or within sort of their professional realm. The survey also identified the limiting factor of working within distinct urban and rural planning domains. So while there's an increased interest in urban food policy and planning, rural and agricultural planning are still primary areas of focus when it comes to food systems. And we saw this both in the focus in planning education and in the kind of food systems work that planners are working on. And when food issues are addressed in urban contexts, they're often narrowly focused on urban agriculture and community gardens. And these are sometimes presented as sort of a silver bullet approach to addressing urban food issues. And in our survey, respondents called on support and more resources to help them address social and economic marginalization in urban communities that contribute to poor health outcomes and food insecurity. And some also highlighted important urban food issues like land access, food insecurity, economic development, food infrastructure, and supply chains. So recognizing that in an urban context, food systems planning and the kind of food issues that need to be addressed are much broader than what is currently being focused on. And this sort of divide between urban and rural planning and the challenges it poses for food systems was addressed in another quote from a survey respondent who said, "The concept of rural and urban have misdirected our thinking, creating an us and them relationship between the two conceived communities. The power of the boundary between so-called urban and rural jurisdictions and the planners who serve them makes no sense and is a big problem." So with this survey, we really aim to identify some needs and required resources that would help planners to better engage in food systems work. And we identified some key areas where support could be provided. So first of all, there's a need to support planners to build knowledge and skill in food system topics and planning processes. And this requires addressing gaps in formal education and in professional development. There's also a need to improve networking opportunities for planners involved in food systems planning. The emerging nature of the food systems planning field requires networks of professionals who can share real-time information and their lessons learned kind of as they're working through these challenges. And finally, there's a need to continue research and provide resources to support comprehensive food systems planning. So research is really key in being able to support and advance innovation in the food systems field and kind of develop and test new concepts and ideas. And research is also the most impactful when it's meaningfully linked to practice. So that's where this project comes in. An important part of our research is connecting with the professional planning community, and we hope to continue to build these relationships as we share findings and continue our research over the next couple of years. So I just wanted to end on some of the next steps and kind of the directions for the research over the next little while. So as mentioned, we're completing the survey report and we'll be sharing the findings from the survey with our partners and with professional planners over the course of the summer and fall. We're also launching phase 2 of our research, and we're working on selecting interesting food system planning case studies from across Canada. And we'll be conducting in-depth analysis of these case study regions through policy review and interviews. And that'll be taking place over the summer and fall as well. So if you're interested in learning more about this project or the work of the ISFS, you can visit our website, and I have here on the slide, this is our project website. So this is where you can find information about the project, and all of our findings and results will be published there. You can also feel free to get in touch with myself or Christy directly if you have any questions or want to learn more about the research. So I encourage you to do so, and our emails are here if you'd like to connect. So thanks so much. And I'm going to pass it on to Christy, who's going to host our panel.
Great. Okay, thanks, Emily, for that overview. That was a great overview of the key high-level findings. For the second portion of the session, we wanted to move into a bit of a panel discussion with some of our planning colleagues from across the province to explore a little bit about what food systems planning in BC looks like on the ground in communities. And so we're really excited to introduce our panelists. So we have 3 panelists today, beginning with Nancy Gothard, who is a registered professional planner, and she's the policy planner for the city of Courtenay. Nancy's been practicing current and long-range municipal planning in a small urban regional center for over 10 years. Bringing a strong sustainability lens to all aspects of her work, Nancy derives satisfaction from exploring the multiple dimensions of resilience with community in the face of a complex, dynamic, and changing world. And Nancy has served on our advisory committee for this project as well, the Planning for Sustainable Food Systems project. So second, we move on to Brad Dolivut, who is the Director of Development Services with the District of Summerlands. Brad also has over 10 years of experience in land use and community planning, economic development, tourism, and development engineering, among other areas. He's worked across Alberta and BC for a number of small rural municipalities and local governments, and is currently the Director of Development Services for Summerlands, located in the Okanagan region of BC. Brad's also passionate about supporting the agriculture industry, having grown up on a 2,000-acre grain farm in northern Alberta, where he experienced the challenges of maintaining or managing a large-scale farming operation. Previously, Brad sat on the City of Penticton's Community Sustainability Committee and on the advisory committee for the Okanagan Bioregion Food System Project. And he also, with Nancy, currently sits on the advisory committee for the Planning for Sustainable Food Systems Project with CIP and ISFS. And last but certainly not least, Virginie Lavallée-Picard is the Food Systems Coordinator with the City of Victoria. And she's been working with the city since 2016 as a Food Systems Coordinator. She coordinates Growing the City, which is an initiative that includes multiple programs and projects to support urban gardening and food production in Victoria. And her background is in food systems planning and policy, and she has about 15 years experience in local food systems as a government employee and as a researcher. And she and her partner also run a certified organic farm in the Chosin, BC. So moving on then, I think we'd like to start out asking each of you to describe some of the top food-related challenges that you face in your community and in your planning work. So maybe we'll start with Nancy, if that's all right.
Yeah, so just a tiny bit of background. The context, City of Courtenay is about 26,000 people. It's the urban center in a region of about 70,000 or so, located on central Vancouver Island. And we do have a strong history of agriculture in our area, and we're rapidly growing. Anything I'm going to say is, I'm going to speak in quite general terms, just because I don't actually work as a core aspect of my work on food systems planning, but it is a tangential part of my work, and I'm certainly aware of a number of initiatives in the community. So in terms of challenges, we know that in our community, there's a lack of sustained access to healthy local food and food skills for vulnerable populations, and that extends also into our schools as well. We know that, and I'm speaking from some research done by one of our food systems nonprofits, Lush Valley, that they did a report that shows indeed that root cause of food insecurity is poverty. And in the Comox Valley, the poverty rate is 16% of the population, almost 11,000 people. 1 in 5 children experience poverty in our community, and about 30% of food bank users are children. We also know that food prices are increasing across the country, and that in general, charitable and government responses and resources focus on emergency health and food services rather than those upstream approaches of empowerment, education, and preventative measures. And so much of our solutions in the Valley revolve around addressing those upstreams. So I'll get into that in a further question. But we really, this kind of vulnerable aspect of food security became really apparent when the pandemic hit. Just that there were many more people going to the food bank, needing what we have a program called Good Food Boxes, and needing more of those kinds of food delivered to their home directly. We also have difficulty with new farmers entering into a farming as a career. The cost of land, you know, and you know, that general global market favors cheap food, that kind of thing. And then food self-sufficiency, being on an island, we are, you know, we're aware that over time, so 1950s, apparently 15% of our food came from the lower mainland. So we were producing the balance of that. Now it's flipped around. We're producing maybe 4% of the food we consume and importing the rest. So that's just a concern because we're on an island as well. And then ALR, you know, we have pressure on our land base. In the city of Courtenay, I wouldn't say there's strong exclusion, you know, pressure to exclude it from the land base. And regardless, we have policy not to support exclusion, land being excluded from the ALR. But, you know, there are some concerns that with more housing being permitted on ALR, those secondary units, is that eroding maybe the potential for those properties to produce food? That's a question that's been raised. We have a lot of ALR land that's not growing food, so it is maybe housing horses, or is just, you know, for enjoyment, speculation maybe. And then on top of which, a lot of our environmentally sensitive areas are on agricultural land reserves. So our local land trust is really aware this is a tension, that, you know, we want to see local food, absolutely, and at the same time we want to protect those values. So those are challenges. And then finally, I would just say a challenge is a coordination of initiatives. We have a really strong nonprofit sector here working on food security in so many dimensions, you know, and it would be interesting to see if it could be harnessed, you know, maybe through a government role, maybe not, but at least just, you know, harnessed, collaborated somehow to really, I guess, tell that message, you know, to the wider community. I think you have to dig a little deeper to see a lot of this work and these challenges in our community. And I think it could be highlighted more. So yeah, that's kind of a wide-ranging summary of our challenges.
That's great. Thanks, Nancy. You probably hit on a lot that I saw Brad and Virginia nodding, but Brad, maybe bring us to the Okanagan and talk about some of the challenges that you're facing.
Yeah, sure. You know, it's great. It seems that a lot of these challenges are not just localized to one community, because they're very similar, I think, to what Nancy just talked about happening here in the Okanagan. And so some background on the district of Summerland. We're located in the South Okanagan, just south of the city of Kelowna. And you know, we're a district municipality, so we have a large land base within our municipality that is dedicated to agricultural production, and there's a strong sense of tie into the agricultural community and industry within the community here. And our local council is very supportive of the agriculture industry and trying to enhance the industry moving forward. So and you know, in terms of challenges locally here, you know, the South Okanagan's the home, along with the small community valley, of the BC tree fruit industry, and that's an industry that with the tree fruit industry specifically is having a significant amount of challenges. with the type of pricing that they're getting for their apples and fruit at the local market, as well as the challenges that they're experiencing within the production phase of getting their apples to market. And that's something that I think that there's not a lot of recognition that we're doing at the local level or regional level, and I think that's something that we can continue to get better on. We can talk about that in a further question, but and I think that COVID-19 as well has kind of exacerbated a lot of their issues that they're experiencing, because there's also been a lack of workers for the industry being able to be brought in to support the industry. There's a need for these producers to have access to temporary foreign workers, as an example, to sustain their operations, and that's been a big factor. And unfortunately, as well, there's been a significant amount of challenge that, similar to what Nancy has talked about, with pressures on the agricultural land base within the ALR. Not just in our region, not just from secondary homes, but which is an issue, but also from the winery industry, which is also exploding over here. In terms of displacing the amount of acres that are currently in food production within the tree fruit industry to a winery use. And you can argue whether wine is a food or not, but it's hard to sustain yourself on just wine. I've tried, it doesn't work too well. Yeah, I think that's good enough for now, but I think that's just a handful of big challenges that we're experiencing here throughout the South Okanagan and Similkameen region, and as well in the District of Summerland.
Great, thank you, Brad. Virginie.
Sure, thank you. I think I'm just gonna, build on what Nancy and Brad have already mentioned. I work with the City of Victoria. We're on the very southern tip of Vancouver Island. We are a very dense, very urban municipality, so I really like the balance of our panel. I think we all bring different and complementary perspectives, so that's quite interesting to me. We in the City of Victoria, food insecurity, in particular in relation to the pandemic, is a big challenge. I think Nancy's painted a really good portrait of what we mean with food insecurity. It's about food access, but it also has to do with food literacy, access to safe, healthy, culturally appropriate foods. That is a big challenge that we face in the City of Victoria, but is of course faced by communities beyond the City of Victoria. There's another piece that is more specific to the urban context, is that because the city is quite small, we have about 90,000 people residents, but we are really a hub for the whole region in terms of the government buildings that are in the City of Victoria, the different enterprises, the different districts, the restaurants, etc. There is a lot of activity in the City of Victoria, and there's a fair amount of park spaces. However, our existing parks and green spaces are very, very, very well used. And so by well used, I mean that they can host a community garden, maybe they're used to throw a frisbee around, maybe they're used as a sports field, etc. But the little green spaces that we have are already very well used by the community. And so when it comes to looking at how we can increase urban food production and urban gardening, within the boundaries of the city, we're left with actually a few options in terms of available land. So that means that we really have to be creative with the small spaces that we have, and that's something that we can talk about more as part of this panel discussion. But yeah, I mean, different, from Courtenay and the District of Summerland, like we don't have any ALR land. The municipalities that surround us have ALR land, but we as a municipality do not have any ALR land. We do have some urban farms, and we do have a number of community gardens, and we have a large amount of nonprofit organizations that have been working in the food system sector for 30, 40 plus years. They've been doing, leading edge, really innovative work to keep incorporating urban gardening and food production in the city. But when it comes to land base, like that is a real limitation in terms of what we can do. I also think it's a bit of an opportunity because it really, again, encourages us to think creatively, think outside the box, try to be innovative. But it also provides an incentive to try to work with other neighboring municipalities on exploring the synergies. I think through this panel, we're going to talk a little bit about the rural-urban divide. I think we are at the point where we really need to start talking about the synergies, and that's something that we're experiencing within the city of Victoria and at the regional level. Maybe just a bit more background. I just want to say that, City of Victoria, we also have a council that's very supportive of urban gardening and urban food production and food system initiatives in general. And in 2016, the council developed a number of new initiatives and programs and policies that were aimed at increasing urban food production and gardening and supporting food systems in general. And over the past 5 or 6 years, we've been introducing a number of new regulations, programs, policies, resources to really try to support that. So there's lots happening, but we also have direction from council that we need to do a lot more. So it's a pretty dynamic work environment, and it's pretty fun.
Great. Interesting. Thanks, Virginie. Yeah, I really like the balance that you're bringing with the urban context there. So thank you for representing those perspectives and issues. Moving along, the next question deals with the tools that have been used or that you find available to help address some of these challenges. So we're talking about the planning tools or techniques or approaches, I guess, that you've been able to use to address some of these. And we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, so just maybe mention a couple of things that come to mind would be great. So we'll keep the same order. I think we'll go to Nancy.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so much in our community is done by the nonprofit sector, and it's done through specific programs. So I will just name just a couple of those programs, but it's not really planning tools. It's more, during the pandemic, there was all of a sudden this Grow Food Everywhere Comox Valley effort to provide gardener support during the pandemic. So online, you can ask a gardener for in your own yard. So just trying to get, more yards growing their own food. And then we have that community good food box that actually our council, number of others have helped fund that continued, getting fresh food from farmers into people who, households who need it in a subsidized way. And then there's also this fruit gleaning project that's been running for so long here. It's just, they organize the volunteers, they pick the fruit, the owner gets some, a food program gets some, and the volunteers get some. And that's really interesting in terms of the city also has an urban forest strategy, and just, we're trying to encourage people to grow trees. We certainly accept fruit trees as tree replacements when obtaining a tree permit. And it's just interesting to see how those things can kind of work together, that maybe someone doesn't want a fruit tree because there's a lot of effort involved, but hey, there's now this extra support. They've even gone so far as to offer some pruning support too, which is, managing that urban forest. I'm just thinking of how, intersects with another, work of local government. We have a lot of really interesting partnerships that I think start to get into that planning realm, again, led by the nonprofit sector. We have this work that was done to look at how to get more local food into housing providers. So there might be some, subsidized housing out there and they're providing meals, but let's get some fresh local food into there. And then there was a lot of work around the farm to schools program, and we have links and reports on all this. So I don't know if if I could share that some other way, but the school salad bar, just getting those into the kids. The kids love salads apparently, so that's great. And then also there was some innovative research at our North Island College looking at how to get more social procurement into institutions and what are the barriers, and so that just the research behind that. So those all those things can help these kind of wider food strategy planning efforts, although we don't have a food systems regional plan. Then I just say some additional planning tools. I mean, just straight up our regulations, land use, we're in the process of, it looks like, we're putting it forward to final bylaw reading, but that we could allow chickens and bees and farm gate sales in all our urban lots, our single family lots. So, okay, that'll be new for us. And then finally, the last kind of tool, I mean, I just really have to say is really just that political support that Virginie mentioned too. And that, the school district is part of that leadership, that elected leadership. And now we have a food policy council, still only a few years old, but that helps. We have elected officials sitting on the food policy council. So bringing all those voices, and I have seen in my time here, all of a sudden food is really, it's getting more attention. So I think those efforts like food policy councils are helping in that regard.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. Brad?
Yeah, with regards to our context here, like I mentioned some of the challenges experienced from the tree fruit industry, and I forgot to mention actually one of the biggest ones we're experiencing is actually a lack of accommodation for temporary farm workers throughout the district. So that's a challenge that we're trying to actually directly help in terms of partnering with the BC government. Actually, the District of Summerland has converted a municipal campground that was previously used by tourists within our region, and for specifically for the agriculture industry, to provide a campground and a dedicated location for temporary workers to reside during their peak season within a municipal, our municipal assets. So that's a partnership that was kind of recently developed. It actually it was developed during COVID. So that's just one tool that we're trying to directly support our farming community within the region to sustain their operations. And regardless of COVID, we're hoping that program continues. And unfortunately, it impacts our tourism industry as well, because there's a lack of tourism accommodation as well within our community. But definitely, our farmers are in need support. So that was a higher priority determination from our council. And then on the planning side, I think the biggest tool we could provide from a land use planning perspective is ensuring that our regulations are, don't stand in the way of an operation being able to grow and diversify and explore innovative ways to pivot their business, their agricultural operation, and also encourage that type of pivoting to occur versus being restrictive. So, and just as an example, one thing that we're working on right now, it's a key priority project of mine, is to review our zoning regulations within our zoning bylaw in the context of agricultural land use regulations, specifically for agricultural zones, and look at how those regulations compare to the agricultural land reserve use regulation, and determining where we can have greater consistency. I think that a lot of our zoning bylaws are in need of updating in terms of, especially with the amount of change that's happened with the agricultural land use reserve regulation. So we, to ensure that there's consistency with those recent changes from the Agricultural Land Commission, and ensuring that our bylaws are kept up to date and kind of reflecting the change of approach from the ALC into our zoning bylaw. Because right now, as an example, like we've got, the ALC allows the use of a mobile home, the placement of a mobile home for family purposes on agricultural land, but right now our zoning bylaw restricts that, so and only allows the placement of a mobile home for farm worker purposes. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there, and then that creates issues for a farmer trying to place a mobile home for, let's say, farm worker purposes or family purposes in that matter, because they're running into jurisdictional differences between our regulations. So if we can get a more streamlined, more consistent, as well as in a way that we can encourage farmers to pivot their businesses, then I think that's something that we got to look for.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Virginie.
Sure. I mean, in terms of tools and resources, the city, it's been a real mix. There's some that are planning specific, some that are less planning specific. So I can just maybe try to give a bit of an overview. Sort of one sort of key element, I think, for the city of Victoria was back in 2016, was to add staff capacity to look at food system initiatives. I think in the past, there was a number of staff that were really quite knowledgeable and quite keen to do food systems work within the city. And even though we have an official community plan, the city of Victoria, that has a chapter that's fully dedicated to food systems, there was not the dedicated staff capacity associated to that. So in 2016, there was the food systems coordinator position was introduced to help coordinate and operationalize a number of new programs and change regulations and so on. So I think that was a big shift. The city has also, over the past 5-6 years, introduced a number of city grants that support community-led gardening projects and food system initiatives. And so they're quite diverse. They include, small micro grants for small community gardening projects, but they also include, we now have what's called the Community Garden Startup Grant. And so there's grants that are available for the design and the convening phase of a new community garden, as well as for the building phase of a community garden. There's also we have a participatory budgeting process grant that has traditionally supported a lot of urban food production, community gardening type of projects here in the city. And then last but not least, in terms of grants, we have a grant that's called the Community Garden Volunteer Coordinator Grant. And it's a bit of a unique grant in that it funds neighborhood associations or nonprofit organizations to hire a person to coordinate volunteers in existing community gardens or other eligible community gardening type projects. And so for us, it's an important piece because these initiatives are led by volunteers, they're carried by volunteers, and so having a point person, someone who's in charge of helping facilitate that volunteering coordination process was a big ask and demand from the community. So there's funding that's being provided by the city to the community for that purpose through that granting stream. We also provide in-kind support for community gardening projects, so that can include compost, leaf mulch. We provide a water access, a new water service for new community gardens when that's needed. We waive water fees. There's all these kind of different mechanisms that we use to support those types of initiatives. And then we, of course, have educational programs that are designed to increase awareness about existing opportunities to grow food in the city. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those later. But from a planning perspective, more specifically, in 2016, we got direction from council to really enable urban farming, small-scale urban farming in the city of Victoria. So we did a big consultation process with urban farmers and urban gardeners in general, and we really tried to identify what areas, what regulations needed to be adjusted, amended to enable small-scale urban farming. And as a result, I'm not going to, go through every single change that we did, but we ended up removing a whole bunch of red tape to small-scale commercial urban farming. And so what that's resulted into, in a nutshell, is changing the zoning regulation bylaw so that now people are allowed to grow and sell foods anywhere throughout the city of Victoria. We don't have zones where it is allowed. You can do it anywhere. You have to get a business license, and you have, of course, to respect. You have to get the business license, and then there's certain setbacks and building permitting process that will continue to apply. But the growing, the selling of the food can be done anywhere throughout the city. It's also been interesting to see the uptake for these small-scale urban food production business licenses. We went from having 10 when we first launched in 2016 to now we're about at 20. So what we think when we look at those numbers is that we need to do a lot more to increase uptake. And I just maybe we'll end that piece by saying that we talk about growing food to sell, but really what's allowed to be grown and sold under these business licenses are raw and processed foods, but it also includes honey, it includes eggs, seeds, plant cutting, fibers, seedlings, etc. So in the city of Victoria, there are no limits on the number of beehives that you can have on your property. However, there is a setback that you have to respect, and there is a maximum of 15 laying hens per property and no roosters. And so people can grow food to sell, including eggs, honey, and all those other products that I listed. And you can also you can also sell food at a small farm stand that you install on your property on the same lot where the food is grown. And so we're seeing these little farm stands starting to pop up throughout the city. There also are a great sort of placemaking tool. And so, we're really seeing how food system is intersecting with our other city programs that relate to placemaking, etc. So I think I will leave it there. Maybe I'll just mention one last thing. Recently, we adopted food system targets. And so that's really helping us track how we're doing. Trying to quantify, because there's a lot of kind of success stories that we hear of, they're anecdotes, but trying to quantify with numbers, with percentages, how we're doing is really what we are trying to move towards in the future.
That's great. Thank you. So much to talk about in so little time. I think I'm actually going to skip one of the questions that we had prepared just because of our timing. So that, and if we have time, we can come back to it at the end. But I'd just like to move on and ask, in your respective contexts, what the future of food systems planning looks like, what you envision it looking like. Yeah, interested to hear that, Nancy.
Sure. Yeah, so I think there's an opportunity here, Comox Valley on the island, to build a collective awareness that we live on an island, that food security cannot be taken for granted, and that food culture is part of our identity, and that it can be infused into our placemaking, our placekeeping, as Virginia was talking about too. We have this agrarian past of our history, but even well before colonialism, the local Comox First Nation, they called this place the land of plenty, and with the ocean and the estuary and the salmon and the shellfish, etc. So there's strong, there's obviously everywhere anyone's ever lived, they've been able to grow food or harvest, but it seems that we have a strong basis of identity here. So we think it would, we're going through an official community plan process right now. And some of the questions people are saying is, what would a growing up subsistence and farm city look like? Maybe that can be part of our identity. So I think, when you start to, when the community starts to infuse that and reflect that back, that's where you're building longevity into, food security being a priority, hopefully in the long run. I think it could be fascinating. I personally would love a role for local government participation and maybe wider coordination and integration of the existing work that's underway with partners, Indigenous partners, the other jurisdictional partners, the nonprofit sector. I personally just feel that food security and the growing of food is like people in their individual yards, maybe not commercial growers, but that it's this gateway activity into climate action, that you directly, you're interacting with your soil, you're more aware to the climate and what's going into your body, what's going into the plant. You want the plant to survive. We have a strong climate mandate in our work here. So I always, I'm just thinking those are nice. I hope that we'll continue to see, public interest in this topic and more efforts.
Great, thank you. Brad, what does the future of food systems planning look like in Summerland?
I think actually COVID-19 has brought to light a lot of the issues of food security and food resiliency, and I guess there's a window of opportunity, I think, right now to stress the importance of food security and resiliency now with coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, to take advantage of kind of some of the issues that were made apparent of the global food interconnected system, and look at, well, how can we better ensure our access to food is going to be secure moving forward, and may perhaps have greater linkages found locally and regionally, and I guess that's the challenge is how do we develop those linkages, those value added chains directly from the producer to the grocery store, and for those chains to be maintained locally. And I think that the trends in food production have been going the other way in terms of it becoming more globally connected system, and there's been benefits for that in terms of definitely pricing. As an example, the price of food has dropped substantially because of it, and we've been able to feed more people as well. I think the COVID-19 has kind of brought to light some of the issues of that type of system, and the need to look a little bit more locally and regionally and ensure that there's a balance of some of the food that you're consuming being from local sources and consumed locally, produced locally. In terms of how planners can help, I think that planners can help that food system planning can be just as important to community vibrancy, to social equity, to the determinations of health, and also to economic vitality of your community than any other type of factor. And so we look at, like Virginia brought up placemaking. We look at placemaking in terms of how that contributes to social equity and to community resiliency and those type of factors. But we often don't look at the food system itself and how that food system is and needs to be integrated in that lens of looking at vitality and community vibrancy together. And as an example, I think we got to look at, we actually have a great examples locally in all of our communities. If we look at our First Nation neighbors, they are already ahead of us in terms of prioritizing food security and access to food, specifically traditional foods from their nation. So you know, they've integrated food system planning in that sense in all of their actions. So when they're talking about, you know, the health and wellness of their communities and the determinants of health, they're looking at, well, do they have access to traditional food, and how do they get that access to traditional food? So I think that there's an example already there. We just need to kind of learn from it as a discipline and see if we can get any tangible outcomes out of it.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, in the urban context, Virginia, what does food systems planning look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think the points that Nancy and Brad made also are several of them are very applicable to the urban context as well. But if you're asking me to put a bit more of an urban lens on it, I think you know, I think we're looking at how we innovate in densifying urban environments. And so what does that look like for us? We're doing a lot of thinking around how we encourage food production and urban gardening and creation of green spaces in both existing and new developments. And so what does that, you know, look like really? We're not sure. Could it be more rooftop greenhouses? Can it be more shared courtyards where you have community gathering space that also have that food production component? It could be, you know, including a small urban farm into the built farm of a new development, etc. We don't really know what it is, but we are trying to encourage it. So we put out a guide actually 2 years ago that was designed to encourage the incorporation of urban food production and urban gardening and other food system assets into both existing and new developments, because that is that is a reality we're in, that densifying urban environments. And it's also for us about looking at how we can use really small spaces for creative and innovative purposes. And so, you know, for example, we have in the city of Victoria a lot of large boulevards. And when we look at the amount of city land that we have available for us, like our boulevards actually represent a fair amount of city green space that are grass right now, right? And so back in 2016, we introduced a set of boulevard gardening guidelines. What those guidelines do essentially, and what the associated bylaws, of course, did, was to enable boulevard gardening anywhere throughout the city. You don't need to get a permit. You do have to follow the boulevard gardening guidelines. It outlines the different safety and aesthetic considerations and requirements that you have to follow, but you can garden a boulevard anywhere throughout the city. So we're trying to think about, you know, how we look to boulevards as a significant asset for greening the city, increasing biodiversity, and in some contexts, growing food. There's also this idea of planting food trees on city land, and so we have a program where nonprofits and residents can apply to plant small groupings of food trees, like up to 5 food trees in a city green space or a little parkette. And that's a way for us to look to tiny little spaces as presenting food production opportunities as well. And really, we talk about them as food production opportunities. I think they're more placemaking opportunities with the food system, with a food production lens, right? I don't think that we are trying to say in any way that we will address food security issues through our community gardening program and through our boulevard gardening program. That's certainly not the goal. I think these programs are a lot more about community building, and they're about increasing awareness of food systems in general. But of course, we're not trying to address food insecurity through these programs. So in our urban context, this is what it looks like. And again, I think I go back to this idea of how do we work with municipalities who and nations and communities around us. We are kind of this urban core. We have municipalities around us, and it would be we're really trying to think about how we work together to increase local food production. And so what is our role as an urban municipality in supporting other municipalities provide access to farmland to new farmers, for example, because that is another big issue in our region. There's an initiative right now being explore at the capital regional district level. It's the creation of a foodlands trust for the region. And so again, this idea, we move away from the idea that, food comes from farms. Actually, it comes from foodlands to be much more inclusive of the traditional use, the traditional First Nation use of our territories in the region. And so sorry, I'm listing a lot of information here, but the idea of this Foodlands Trust program is to get municipalities to work together to make foodlands available to community members who are interested in growing food. And so new farmers, incubator program, that kind of stuff. But it's a coming together of those different municipalities to explore synergies and to find solutions together.
Great. So lastly, and Brad kind of alluded to this already, but taking a step back and looking at the broader scope of this project again, when we look at the planning profession, how do you think food systems planning can be advanced within the profession? Maybe in 1 minute, your insights on that question would be great.
Sure. I know that the CIP is a partner on this work, and having a policy for planners, right on the CIP website, that would be helpful, just how to think about it, and just affirming that it is a part of our responsibility. Partnering with other high profile agencies, I'm thinking Island Health here on the island, they're excited about food security. I think people are, really thinking about health. So I think that's, it's a really good alignment. Finding a way to support planners in making the case for local government. I mean, I'm in a local government, so local government involvement in this issue. We often hear, jurisdiction, not our jurisdiction. It's just a reality of how we talk about our role in our communities. So somehow we have to break through that in some communities to help understand that it definitely can be part of our jurisdiction. And then, things like just, those our landscape guidelines and the development permit, could we be, encouraging, requiring more food plants? One unique thing I hadn't thought of before, someone brought it up, was in our environmental impact assessments, making sure that the inventory is of plants and ecosystems is identifying plants of indigenous food or medicinal importance as well. And so, we're not asking for that now, but we certainly could be. And I guess finally, maybe thinking of, we have a lot of single family property, probably in most communities in BC, and there's so much land there and potential to for biodiversity or food security or whatnot. If we were getting everybody excited about using their properties in those greater roles, I think, our landscapes could be quite transformative. That's land use on a parcel by parcel scale, but, collectively could be a big impact. So I'm always excited about those kinds of efforts. And so it's land, so it's a planning, question.
Great, thanks. Brad, did you want to add anything to your previous answer?
Yeah, I did. I think the biggest message I'd like to pass along to fellow planners is it's not enough to just be experts on interpreting the agricultural land use reserve regulation, and that's it. And we have to reach out broader, educate ourselves as to some of the dynamics happening in the food industry already, in terms of pricing, the economics of running an agricultural business for a farm operator is drastically changing, and we need to understand those changes and be able to support our farmers that are already trying to make a living, because unfortunately, if they don't get that support from us or their municipal and regional elected officials, they're probably not going to survive. So I think that that's the biggest role that we can, is educating ourselves and then being an advocate. Councils, they need to be educated about these issues that are happening within our communities. So it's incumbent on us to learn more about what's happening right now in on the land. Yeah, and so just deferring to just being experts and interpreting the land use regulations, I'm sorry, planners, that's not enough. We got to do more.
All right, thanks. And Virginie.
Sure. I mean, I think just building on what Brad was saying, like I think food systems planning is already being advanced by the development of all these existing resources and networks, right? So for me, what the work that KPU's done in the food policy database is something that's very helpful. There's the Food Communities Network, which is a network of food system planners, across Canada. Sorry, not food system planners, only food system planners and practitioners. That are networking people working with local governments in food systems throughout the country. And so I think that these opportunities for learning, they're mushrooming, like there's just so many more of them. And I think that's really heartening. And I think, yeah, I mean, part of our role is just to dive right in and to connect with one another and learn from one another to see what's working, how we can work together, and learn from each other. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Sorry, I was just going to say that's a great note to end on. Thanks, Virginie. Thanks very much to all of you for sharing your perspectives and experiences across the province. It's been a really great discussion, and I wish we could just keep going for another hour, but we can't. And we're really grateful, Emily and I. This relationship with the planning community is really an important part of this research project, and we're really grateful to all of you for your contributions to helping flesh that part out, and I think really laying the groundwork for discussions that we hope will continue through the ongoing stages of this project and within the profession as well. So we'd like to thank you again. And Emily, I don't know if you want to just share the last slide for the PIBC folks that are watching this session. Thanks for tuning in. We're happy to be contacted and to talk more about our research. You can see our info is up there. And we thanks everyone for tuning into the session and for your participation.